Come, children of God, to the house of the Lord.
Come, children of God, to hear the Spirit's wisdom.
Come, children of God, to be the hands and feet of Christ.
Your word is a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path.
Lord, you once gave the Great Commission to your disciples. We have inherited that ancient mission of the church.
In all our work, we will keep your word and the mission illuminated before us, guiding us through each decision.
The disciples waited in Jerusalem for Pentecost and the coming of the Holy Spirit.
As we prepare our hearts for Pentecost, we remember the many gifts of the Spirit and the call to serve others with those gifts.
Lord, with your gifts, you set apart some to be leaders of the church.
But we recognize that the work of the church has grown complicated.
We have many tools of connection: conversations around tables, discussions via email, Zoom calls, and text messages.
Never before have we been so capable of responding so quickly to the needs of our community, but things still get in the way.
Bureaucratic red tape binds our hands, the hands of Christ.
Complicated decision-making pathways trip up our feet, the feet of Christ.
And the mission suffers for it.
What if we removed that which weighs us down?
What if we simplified our decision-making process?
What if we were to clear the mission, if we were clear that the mission comes first?
What if we streamlined the church business that we do around tables
and launched an avalanche of empowered laity to minister in the community?
It just might revitalize the church and transform the world.
Amen.
Today's first scripture reading comes to us from Exodus, chapter 18, verses 13 to 23, and this is the translation from the Message. The next day, Moses took his place to judge the people. People were standing before him all day long, from morning to night. When Moses' father-in-law saw all he was doing for the people, he said, "What's going on here? Why are you doing all this and all by yourself, letting everybody line up before you from morning to night?" Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me with questions about God. When something comes up, they come to me. I judge between a man and his neighbor and teach them God's laws and instructions." Moses' father-in-law said, "This is no way to go about it. You'll burn out and the people right along with you. This is way too much for you. You can't do this alone. Now listen to me. Let me tell you how to do this so that God will be in this with you. Be there for the people before God, but let the matters of concern be presented to God. Your job is to teach them the rules and instructions, to show them how to live, what to do. And then you need to keep a sharp eye out for competent men who fear God, men of integrity, men who are incorruptible, and appoint them as leaders over groups organized by the 1,000, by the 100, by 50, and by 10. They'll be responsible for the everyday work of judging among the people. They'll bring the hard cases to you. But in the routine cases, they'll be the judges. They will share your load, and that will make it easier for you. If you handle the work this way, you'll have the strength to carry out whatever God commands you, and the people in their settings will flourish also. Our second reading this morning comes from 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 13, also from the Message. If anyone wants to provide leadership in the church, good. There are preconditions. A leader must be well thought of, committed to his wife, cool and collected, accessible, and hospitable. He must know what he's talking about, not be over fond of wine, not pushy but gentle, not thin-skinned, not money hungry. He must handle his own affairs well, attentive to his own children and having their respect. For if someone is unable to handle his own affairs, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a new believer, lest the position go to his head and the devil trip him up. Outsiders must think well of him, or else the devil will figure out a way to lure him into his trap. The same goes for those who want to be servants in the church. Serious, not deceitful, not too free with the bottle, not in it for what they can get out of it. They must be reverent before the mystery of the faith, not using their position to try to run things. Let them prove themselves first. If they show they can do it, take them on. No exceptions are to be made for women. Same qualifications: serious, dependable, not sharp-tongued, not overly fond of wine. Servants in the church are to be committed to their spouses, attentive to their own children, and diligent in looking after their own affairs. Those who do this servant work will come to be highly respected, a great credit to this Jesus faith. The word of life for God's people.
So in 1984, Ray Parker Jr. asked, if there's something strange in your neighborhood, who are you going to call? If there's something weird and it don't look good, who are you going to call? Some of you are way more excited than others about that. If you had a particular supernatural problem, there was a fictitious 4-man team you could call that had specialized skills to solve your ghostly problems. And it's like that for many problems in our world. If you have a problem with your sink, you can call a plumber. If you have a problem with your health, you can call a doctor. If you have a problem with your car, call a mechanic. If you have a problem with your taxes, call a CPA. These are specialists who play an important role in keeping our modern society functioning. But who do you call when you need someone who can solve many different kinds of problems? Problems that you may not even know that you have yet. When a government, a business, or a church knows that they need someone to guide them through the coming years, and you don't yet know what kinds of problems those years will bring, well, who do you call? You don't call a specialist. You call a leader. Now, different organizations look for slightly different qualities in their leaders, but generally, leaders are chosen for character and values. The exact skills that a leader will need to solve a particular problem, they can either be gained later on or they can be outsourced to an expert. But it's character and values that will tell you what direction that leader will take an organization. In the church, when we are deciding who to put into positions of leadership, it's important that we not look for specialization, but for people who will be godly leaders. So in Exodus 18, we see an example of this when Moses was trying to help the people solve their disputes with their neighbors. Moses' father-in-law recognized that Moses was doing too much work on his own, which would quickly lead to burnout. So he instructed Moses to find some helpers to serve as judges. And those helpers needed to fear God, have integrity, be incorruptible. They were not looking for people with prior experience as lawyers, but rather people whose hearts were in the right places. You see another example in 1 Timothy 3. Paul was giving Timothy guidance on how to choose the leaders for the early church, and both men and women were said to needed to be faithful to their spouses, good to their children, not struggling with alcoholism or perhaps other addictions, not greedy, not deceitful. Leaders of the church needed to be respected by others, hospitable, wise, gentle, and reverent. And it was also important that they be mature in their faith, not recently converted, to make sure that their faith had deep roots to guide them. Well, hopefully, none of this so far sounds earth-shattering to you. Hopefully, it feels fairly common sense that leaders of the church should have strong Christian faith, Christian characteristics, Christian values. That part shouldn't be controversial. And yet, every now and then, you'll find a story about, for example, a church finance committee chair who hasn't given $1 to the church in years, or a trustees member who doesn't attend worship or small groups or mission projects. Those stories are out there. Maybe you've heard one of them yourself. I don't know the full history of this congregation. I just know, broadly speaking, churches of all denominations struggle with that kind of thing. But what I do know is that in the United Methodist Church, there's a very common rhythm when it comes to choosing leaders, and I'm going to own this. I have done this myself more than once. Sometime in the fall, the nominations committee will get together and take a look at the list of open officers for the church that need filling for the next year. And then the nominations committee will grab a church pictorial directory to jog our memory of who could we call to persuade to spend the next 3 years on a committee. Often, someone who works professionally in accounting will be marked for finance committee. Someone who has professional construction experience will be noted to serve on trustees. And someone with HR experience will be identified for staff parish relations. See, in many cases, we look to fill our church committees with people's secular specialties. Okay, so once nominations has all their brainstorming notes written down, then the committee discusses which member of the committee should make which phone call to which prospective leader to increase the chance that that person will say yes. Some of you have served on nominations committee before and you've made those phone calls. And many of you have received one of those phone calls. And you can tell me privately sometime how much you enjoyed those phone calls. So for churches who choose to switch to a simplified accountable structure, there's a different way that's recommended for choosing leaders. And it has nothing to do with specialized skills. In the training book that we're using, Mission Possible 3 by Kotan, Kotan writes that the board leaders need to be completely dedicated to Jesus Christ, be growing as disciples, and be personally invested in the church's mission. We can find experts in building, banking, human resources most anywhere. But to lead a church, it is most important to have our most mature disciples at the table. And I suspect that most churches truly want that, right? We want to have mature disciples in positions of leadership, but in the legacy structure, where churches have 4, sometimes 5 or 6 administrative committees, churches have anywhere from 20 to 50 committee seats to fill. So it's really hard for a nominations committee to have some kind of meaningful process to fill those seats in the average sized church. It's just a simple reality. But in a simplified accountable structure, there are fewer leadership positions that need to be nominated and elected. So the nominations committee has room to be a little bit more intentional about its process it uses to find, identify, and invite new leaders. Now, the full name of this committee is actually the Committee on Nominations and Leadership Development. That's a mouthful, which is probably why we don't say it very often. But I love the full name because it draws attention to the fact that there is a role to develop leaders here. But rarely does that part come into the committee's work. But in our book of discipline, paragraph 258, if you ever want to read it, this committee is charged to identify, develop, deploy, evaluate, and monitor Christian spiritual leadership for the congregation, and provide a means for identifying spiritual gifts and abilities, along with discerning the leadership needs of the church. Friends, that's a really big charge. That is a year-round kind of thing. That is not a meet once or twice in the fall kind of thing. And so to achieve it, SAS recommends that the committee develops this leadership development pathway where laity are given opportunities to lead smaller projects and ministry teams with access to mentors and ongoing learning. And I know that some version of this was in this church a few years ago. I've heard some stories about some intentional processes to help leaders get ready to become other kinds of leaders in the church. So it's not something that would be totally brand new. It would just be a little more intentional and perhaps look a little bit differently. So when the nominations committee sits down to plan their slate of nominees, in SAS, they're not grabbing a church directory of hundreds of members. They grab the profile sheets of 8, maybe 10 people who are in this leadership development pathway. Well, some of those developing leaders will discover that they're more suited to leading a ministry team. Some of them will discern that they're not quite ready to make a 3-year commitment to the board. It's not the right season in their life. So then the nominations committee is left with 5 to 7 mature disciples who have proven themselves capable of stepping up to the next level of leadership. And every year, the nominations committee only needs to choose 3 of them to join the board and 1 or 2 of them to join the nominations committee. Now, in the past, I believe this church had a practice of not only nominating and electing every single committee member, but also every ministry leader. And if that's true, then that's one thing that would be different in SAS. So in SAS, the governing board members are elected, but the ministry team leaders are selected. So ministry team leaders, some of them are hired as paid staff. Those are going to be typically selected by the governing board in their role as SPRC, as well as the pastor or whoever their immediate supervisor is. While our volunteer laity ministry team leaders, they'll be selected either by the pastor or, again, whoever in the church ministry structure they would be accountable to. And I should clarify that it's not just governing board members who are elected, though. In SAS, you retain this separate nominations committee that's also elected because we don't want the governing board to be self-nominating. There's that little checks and balances there. So logistically, what does this look like? When the committee presents its slate of nominees, the slate lists exactly 9 board members. 6 of them are returning, 3 of them are new. And among them, someone would be designated as the board chair, there's a lay leader, a member at an annual conference. Additionally, there are 9 members, up to 9 members for the nominations committee. Again, most are returning, a few newbies. And if the church is going to elect its treasurer, the treasurer would also be listed on the slate. That's one of those areas of SAS where a local church can decide how it wants to choose its treasurer. And that's it. The next step is sending that slate of nominees to the annual charge conference. Now that part may have sounded very tedious and boring, and the next part's not going to be any better. So just warning you here. But it's really important to know this difference. The annual charge conference elects the members of the governing board and the Committee on Nominations and Leadership Development. It's the charge conference. This is a rule from our book of discipline. But the charge conference only consists of the church council or the governing board, the nominations committee, the pastor, and any other clergy who are connected to the church. That's a really small group of people who are deciding to fill these very few roles of leadership. So, in a simplified accountable structure, we are putting a great deal of trust and responsibility into the hands of only 9 members of the board. So to create greater buy-in, to have stronger checks and balances, SAS recommends that the annual charge conference be convened as an all-church conference every single year, so that all professing members and affiliate members of the church may vote. So if a member of the church has concerns about who has been nominated to a position of leadership, using an all-church conference gives them a way to have a say. And when you have a larger percentage of the church members approving the governing board members, then the board has a stronger mandate to lead the church. If our church chooses to adopt this SAS thing, our nominations committee is going to have an extra round of training that they'll have to do to prepare for this new model of identifying and evaluating leaders. Because there's not a single prescribed way that the nominations group must do its work, but Mission Possible recommends using an interest form, an application form, an interview, or some combination of those. So some questions that you might ask potential leaders: are they committed to the vision of the church? Are they committed to our church's welcoming statement? Are they worshiping regularly, giving regularly, serving regularly? Board members should not simultaneously be ministry team leaders, but board members should be participating in ministry. Can they effectively represent the entire church and not just a specific ministry that they're passionate about? Do they have capacity to be fully involved as a board member in the season of their life? Because there's no room on an SAS board for honorific seats or frequent absences. Just a heads up. And of course, it's still very important that we look for diversity in age, gender, race, and ethnicity, and even length of church membership. The more kinds of voices we have represented, the better our decisions will be. So I want to end by asking you to share something with us, to share what questions you think are important for a nominations committee to ask potential leaders. So at the bottom of your bulletin insert, there is a space for you to write down any questions that you think would be important to ask potential leaders. And if you tear that portion off and leave it in the offering plate as you exit the sanctuary today, I promise we will hold on to those and we'll use them this fall when we're looking for next year's leaders. Whether we use our current structure or a different structure, we can still ask these kinds of questions to choose our leaders. Because it doesn't really matter what kind of structure you have, asking good questions to get godly leaders is really important.